Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Web Union, and in this one we see that the Russians have managed to advance within the Kursk region and the Sumy region in the northeastern section of the front line. The Russians also managed to advance in the direction of the northern flank and the western flank of Toretsk, where recent Russian offensive operations are centered around the fortified positions in between that of Toretsk and Pokrovsk, as well as the area around Toretsk itself. In the eastern section of the front line, there's been several advances in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region and some advances in the Zaporizhia region, as well as in the eastern section as well. However, the main efforts of the Russian forces this month has been centered around Toretsk and the fortified positions to the west, where the Russians have launched a new offensive, as well as some offensive operations in the northern section of the front line. Starting out in the north, the Russians have managed to enter Loknya and gain a foothold in the northern parts of the town and have reached the central parts where fighting is taking place right now. The Russians are here continuing the offensive operations along the Loknya river line, where the objective is to reach Unakivka. This is to cut off the supply line of the Ukrainian forces into the Kursk region towards Oleshnya. The Russians are also recently been fighting over the outskirts of Oleshnya, where the objective of the Russians is to gain control over Oleshnya, clear up the main highway, gain control of it, and attack Unakivka from the northern and eastern flanks. Gaining control over Loknya will also allow the Russians to expand in a westward direction, where they can look to flank the Ukrainian positions within Bilovody and Yablunivka, and also to flank the town of Unakivka itself by advancing towards the highway and cutting off the western supply route to Unakivka itself. The Russians are here launching shaping operations for future offensive operations into the Sumy region. They need to gain control over important logistical hubs for a bridgehead across the border area for further offensive operations towards the city itself. At the same time, the Russians have also managed to advance within the Kursk region, kicking the Ukrainians to the very outskirts of it, where the Ukrainians only held their positions within Oleshnya and Gorenel, and now they have reached the very outskirts of the border area, where the Russians are fighting over the outskirts of Gorenel from the northern flank and the outskirts of Oleshnya from the southern flank. With this, we see that the final days of the Ukrainian Kursk incursion are here, as the Ukrainians have been pushed to the very brink of the border area. Similar to their situation in the Belgorod region, the Ukrainians barely hold anything of the Russian territory. The final part that the Russians will look to capture would be Otruba, which is not a priority at all due to the same river going through the northern flank of Popovo-Leshetsky. This means that it is an isolated area, it is a march area, there's also forest patches, so it's very difficult terrain to traverse through, and it would not bring any benefits for the Russians to recapture it. It is simply an village that has been abandoned by the Russian forces until the end of the war. They'll not look to regain control of it unless they gain full control over a wider area that will allow them to take it practically without a fight. Therefore, we see that the main efforts of the Russian forces is now centered around the Kursk, Sumy, Kharkiv, and Belgorod regions, where heavy fighting is taking place. According to the Ukrainian General Staff, the Russians have increased their offensive operations within the Sumy region and also within the Kharkiv region, where they continue to develop offensive operations for a larger offensive they expect to take place within the next 2 months. In the eastern section of the front line, the Russians have managed to advance to the north of Drushba, gaining control over several fortified positions of the Ukrainians and some forest lines. The Russians are here clearing the fortifications to the north of Drushba to move into Dashne and gain control over the area from a southern and northern flank, where they are looking to combine their forces in a pincer maneuver towards the railway area, cut off the Ukrainian foothold within Drushba, and then move along the railway in a northern direction. At the same time, we see that the offensive operations that took place in the northwest of Toretsk, there's been no updates on it. If we assume that the Russians have managed to consolidate their positions and entrench themselves in the northwestern parts, they'll be able to launch offensive operations, gain control over the fortified positions, and then move onwards towards the railway, which will be their main focus, to then advance alongside the railway from the northern direction, and with a push from the southern direction towards Dashne, they'll be able to connect at Deliivka and gain control over the entire area here north of Toretsk, where they'll be encircling the Ukrainian forces through the railway to the east, the highway to the west, and the fortified positions they'll be entrenching themselves within. This will allow the Russians to gain a significant advantage in the northern flank of Toretsk, completely securing the city from this direction, and then able to redirect their forces to the western flank, where the fighting will be centered around Cherbenivka and Katerinivka, where the objective is to gain full control over the western flank as well. And the front line would look something like this, which will allow them to launch offensive operations from Chasiv Yar and from the Toretsk directions to connect around Oleksandro-Shultine and Bilaura, which will allow the Russians to gain control over the entire fortified area here in between the two cities, and allow the Russians to start fighting over the outskirts of Konstantinivka from the southeastern and eastern flanks. At the same time, it will allow the Russians to significantly improve their positions here to the southwest of New York, where the Russians have managed to gain control over several fortified positions along the main highway, moving towards the next defensive line of the Ukrainians that is centered around Sukhapelka to the east and Kalynove to the west. The Russians also managed to gain control over the remaining parts of Kalynove, as well as the fortified positions to the southeast of the town. The Russians now have full control over Kalynove, both the northern, eastern, and western outskirts of the town. However, fighting continues over the fortified positions to the northwest of it, following the Russian advances to the west of Kalynove, and within Kalynove itself, the Russians will be looking to put their fortified positions in a pincer maneuver, where the main push will likely come from the western flank towards the fortified positions in its rear, to bypass the geographical advantages the Ukrainians have from the southern and eastern directions. The Russian capture of Kalynove was confirmed with this geolocated footage. We also saw Russian soldiers raising the flags throughout the town. So from this, we see that the Russians have significantly improved their positions within the fortified zone here in between Toretsk and Pokrovsk, capturing about 30% of it within just a few days. Now we'll see the Russians will continue their offensive operations in the northern direction, gain control over the remaining fortified positions in two different stages, where the main efforts will be around Kalynove itself to bypass the fortified positions and defensive lines of the Ukrainians, following which the Russians will look to advance into the second line of defense, which is centered around Oleksandropil, Soria, and Rubenivka, following which the Russians will gain control over this entire area in the western flank of Toretsk. And if we draw all of the advances the Russians are currently working on together, the Russians will have a significantly improved position here in the eastern section of the front line, where the Russian advances will be centered around several layers of fortified positions the Ukrainians have prepared over many years. And at the same time, the Russians will have reached the outskirts of Konstantinivka from the southern and eastern flanks. During Chasiv Yar and Toretsk will allow the Russians to have two bridgeheads for offensive operations and logistical hubs for offensive operations into Konstantinivka. However, the Russians would not yet attack the city itself. Instead, they'll redirect their forces to focus on the defensive line of the Ukrainians to the west of Konstantinivka and to bypass Pokrovsk from the eastern flank as well. The Battle of Pokrovsk, where the Russians have reached the outskirts of the city, similar to the prognosis of the fighting near Konstantinivka, the Russians are looking to bypass the city rather than storm it directly. Therefore, the Russians will be working on improving their attacks on the flanks. The Russians were stalled in the western flank of Pokrovsk and to the south of Pokrovsk due to numerous Ukrainian counterattacks to improve their positions and prevent a Russian cutting of the supply lines of the Ukrainians, as the supply lines going into Pokrovsk from the western direction are extremely important for the Ukrainians to cut travel time and to increase the supplies and logistical capabilities of the Ukrainians within the city and for further supplies along further down the road. If both of these roads are cut, then the Ukrainians would have a much wider road, longer road to resupply their forces. This will complicate the logistical situation of the Ukrainians. Therefore, the Russians are looking to cut off the supply routes from every direction except from the northern direction, from which they can focus their artillery and FPV drones to strike, and this will operationally encircle the city in its entirety. Therefore, the Ukrainians have been preventing this by launching their own counterattacks and concentrating forces in this direction. But now that the Russians have significantly improved their positions to the east and will continue to do so over this next few weeks as they continue offensive operations, they'll be able to siege Konstantinivka as well, and they'll be able to launch offensive operations on the eastern flank of Pokrovsk to bypass the fortified positions and move on to the next line of defense, from which the supply lines of the Ukrainians would be significantly limited from numerous to a few, and this will improve the logistical situation and the advantageous position of the Russians and significantly complicate the defensive capabilities and logistical capabilities of the Ukrainians. We're currently seeing the last few operations by the Russians to improve the logistical situation and to probe the Ukrainian defenses ahead of the next offensive, which will take place over the next few months. A few months ago, I made a prediction that the Russians would not launch any major offensive during this negotiation phase with the United States. However, this is only as long as it is a reasonable discussion. However, it has become clear that Donald Trump is not looking to find peace in Ukraine, but to find a favorable deal for himself rather than anything else. And this has led to both Ukraine and Russia becoming disillusioned with the United States in terms of negotiating a peace. And therefore, I believe it is impossible for the United States to negotiate a peace in this war unless they directly threaten both sides. And at that point, it would not really make any sense. And therefore, I believe that there is no possibility of a peace on the terms of the United States. Instead, this war will be determined militarily, and we'll have to see how exactly that develops. Trump can choose to either abandon Ukraine or to support them more than Joe Biden even has. And in either case, it will simply be the time needed for Russia to win this war, because as we have seen since the start, the Russians have had a significant advantage. The only possibility I can see for myself right now that Russia does not win this war is if Ukraine is able to drag on this war for another 10 years until Europe remilitarizes, and at that point they'll be able to send additional aid and additional help to Ukraine. But even at that point, Ukrainians do not have the necessary manpower to hold on for 10 years, much less point after that. And we see an example of such with the Ukrainians. They have not yet lowered the militarization and mobilization age to 18, but they did include a new law that allowed 18 to 24-year-olds to volunteer. This happened on the 11th of February. So for the past 2 months, less than 500 within that age group have actually volunteered. And this shows how little they actually want to fight, despite the option being offered to them. And unless they are forced to fight, they will not really be doing so. And at that point, it will be too costly for Ukraine as a state. Therefore, in conclusion, what I believe is that the Ukrainians will continue fighting until the end, and that end may take a few years, but it is completely unreasonable for that to take more than 5 to 10 years. Instead, we will see that the Russian offensive operation this summer will likely be a significant change to the front line, where they capture at least a few thousand square kilometers. And following that, we'll see that the Russians will look to gain full control over the Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions here in the eastern and southern section of the front line. If war still does not end and no peace is negotiated, then the Russians will increase their goals and look to capture regions such as Kharkiv, Sumy, Dnipro, Mykolaiv, and Odessa, or a capitulation of Ukraine by launching another offensive towards Kiev. And based on this, we see that the costs of this war will significantly increase over the next few years. However, I believe that the Russians are now looking to end this war sooner rather than later. However, it is a requirement for them to achieve their goals of this war that they stated at the start. Therefore, we'll see the fighting will continue, remaining centered around the eastern and southern section of the front line, but we may see some movements towards the capital, which will be taking place from the eastern and northern flanks. And if they expand to Belarusian territory again, then we may see operations towards Chernihiv and near the western flank of the Dnieper River line as well. However, these operations would all be very difficult, as you'd have to go through layers of Ukrainian defenses that have been built on the northern border, the generally difficult terrain from that direction. Therefore, it's likely that the focus will be from the eastern direction. And based on that, we can see that the focus will be centered more around the east and the south. And this is likely the main efforts of the Russians will be centered around, rather than the northern section. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching, and have a great day.